He heard 3 words that broke his week. "They're worried about your fit." Ethan didn't register them at first. They were light, a manager's tone, the kind that slides over spreadsheets and into small talk. But they landed like a pebble in a still pond. The ripple was immediate. His palms dampened, his chest narrowed, his mind began to replay every meeting where he'd stumbled over an answer, every pause he'd taken that might have looked uncertain. By the time he left the room, he had a running list of reasons this must mean he was failing, stupid, not enough. The scene sits in most of us the same way. A phrase, an expression, a missed message. We fold it inward, examine it under a microscope, and build a verdict. For Ethan, the remark triggered a whole week of second-guessing. Auto-replies he rewrote 4 times, a presentation he postponed, an anxious night replaying the interaction until the memory felt larger than it had been. In the small apartment that night, dishes in the sink and the city muffled outside the windows, his inner voice unwound itself into a more confident version. "I should have said X. I need to look for another job. Maybe I'm not cut out for this." The soundtrack was familiar to him. It had been playing in low volume for years. What was new was the intensity. The 3 words were the match. The pattern was the tinder. This is where the book starts, not with a grand failure or a diagnosis, but with a normal human moment that becomes enormous in the mind. And it's useful to name the first thing that happens. Our brain makes the personal the default setting. Research suggests that our nervous systems evolved to prioritize potential threats. It made survival efficient to assume that odd noises, sudden movement, or exclusion could be signs of danger. Social standing mattered. In small groups, being ostracized could mean actual peril. So our present-day alarm systems, quick, loud, persuasive, still treat social slights like survival problems. That wiring served distant ancestors well. Today, it often exaggerates the meaning of a passing comment or a brief silence. What that means for Ethan, and for you, is not that you are faulty. It's that you are operating with a biological bias. You are built to assume the world is pointing at you. That default does not make you right. It simply gives you a leg up when life required hypervigilance. The good news is you can train the system to pause, to question, and to choose a different response. If this is hitting close to home and you plan to listen through the full story, there's a simple companion worksheet designed to help you practice the first tools you'll meet here. Download it to keep the exercises practical and immediate. A few minutes after the meeting, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, shoulders slumped, phone face down like it might explode. He craved 2 things, explanation and absolution. He wanted someone to tell him it wasn't his fault. He also wanted to know exactly what to fix. Instead, his mind offered worst-case edits. He replayed the manager's face, then, as happens, punished the manager's intentions with an explanation of malice. They were undermining me. This is one of the common traps, the quick leap to assume the interior motives of others. Psychologists call this the fundamental attribution error. We attribute behavior we see to people's character, but our own behavior we explain by circumstance. When Ethan heard, "They're worried about your fit," his brain handed him a character verdict, inadequate. That verdict did something else. It sharpened his memory selectively. He could suddenly recall every minor mistake, every stutter, each colleague's frown from months ago. Confirmation bias, the mind's natural tendency to favor information that fits an existing belief, was hard at work. If Ethan already had a thin thread of doubt about his capabilities, that thread was now a rope. There was also a quieter, more self-centered lens at play. Not selfish in the moral sense, but cognitive. The mind favors interpretations that center the self. If someone smiles less often, it's about you. If a meeting runs late, it's because you didn't do enough. This self-centered bias doesn't mean the world literally revolves around you. It simply gives your mind a shortcut that often makes you the protagonist of small dramas. Ethan had learned to tolerate this inner criticism. He had collected it like luggage, a backpack of rocks he dutifully carried piece by piece. Each remark that landed lightly on others landed as a stone on him. Over the years, the pack had grown too heavy. He could no longer run uphill without it pulling him back. He was not reckless in relationships. He was kind by habit and competent enough at work to be dependable. Yet the habit of taking things personally made everything costlier. Conversations required performance, rest felt provisional, and the immediate feedback of another's glance could erase his day. We will return to the neuroscience and the cognitive biases in more detail, but first it's useful to name the 4 kinds of attacks, patterns of behavior from others that often trigger us. These are not moral labels. They are categories that help you decode why people's words hurt so much. For Ethan, they became a map. The first is projection. A man in a meeting loses his temper about budget cuts and calls his teammate lazy. What did this man really feel? Overwhelmed, vulnerable, fearing inadequacy.
To avoid feeling the sting of his own shortfall, he attaches a label to someone else. The effect, the target, feeling accused, defends or collapses. Ethan has often received projection. When a colleague criticizes his pace, it was sometimes that colleague's anxiety about deadlines projected outward. Displacement is the second pattern.
It's the classic misdirected anger. Your partner has a bad day at work. They come home and pick a fight about dishes. The real target, the stressor at work, is too risky or abstract, so the emotion lands on a safer object. Ethan experienced this with friends who, tired and fragile, would snap at him about trivialities. He would replay what he'd said, as if his order of words could have justified the storm. In truth, the storm came from elsewhere. Insecurity shows up as diminished people. Someone who feels fragile attempts to make others feel smaller to feel bigger. A boss who publicly critiques a small error to remind the team of their standards may be feeding their own fear of scrutiny. Insecurity can masquerade as tough love or candor. For Ethan, the sting of an insecure colleague often felt like proof the world was hostile, rather than a reflector of the other person's inner tremor. Control is the last pattern. This one is strategic. A person exerts dominance to maintain certainty. Control can look like micromanaging, imposing rules without consultation, or belittling dissent. The aim is not always malicious. Sometimes it's a learned habit. Everyone who has been micromanaged knows the feeling. The more control others exert, the less confident you become in your own judgment. Ethan had worked for a manager who used control as a substitute for leadership. The result was not improved performance, but a team squeezed into obedience. Each of these patterns leaves a mark. Projection feels like accusation. Displacement feels random and confusing. Insecurity feels belittling. Control feels like imprisonment. And each one, when internalized, becomes evidence in the mind that the self is deficient. The story of the week following "They're worried about your fit" threads through all four patterns. The manager's remark, in that office context, was projection. A leader's fear of budget scrutiny dislodged outward as an evaluation of team fit. That projection nudged Ethan into the displacement chain as he called a friend to vent and snapped at her over dinner. Insecurity crept in later when he received an offhand comment from a peer about sloppy slides. A neighbor's controlling habit, the tendency to assert an opinion as the only path, left him feeling boxed in when he expressed a different view. It was patterning everywhere. The world seemed to conspire to prove the narrative his mind was telling. You're not enough. The cost of taking these incidents personally showed up in many places at once. Sleep frayed, appetite shifted. The physical symptoms were not dramatic but persistent. A tension headache that lived behind his eyes, a jaw clenched into waking. Emotionally, he became less patient with his partner. Small disagreements escalated. At work, he avoided volunteering ideas. No one fired him. No crisis erupted. It was a series of small erosions, and those are often the deadliest to a sense of self.
We tell the story this way because it is common. We also tell it because there is a pattern to how change happens. First recognition, then curiosity, then practice. Ethan's recognition began the night of the remark. Curiosity knocked soon after when he found a battered notebook at a used bookstore and started writing down the moments that made him lose his balance. That notebook became a quiet laboratory. He wrote the event, then he wrote the thought that followed, then the feeling, then the consequence. The act of writing was not therapy in the clinical sense. It was a small experiment in observation. The pattern emerged: thought, feeling, reaction, consequence. Repetition of this log helped him see that the thought often leapt to judgment without sufficient evidence. It was a small revelation. Most of the pain came from an interpretation, not from an incontrovertible fact. That simple distinction, interpretation versus fact, was the hinge between remaining at the mercy of others and regaining control. It does not mean you should become indifferent or robotic. It means you can choose how to respond when someone else's words or actions arrive. One evening, a memory arrived uninvited, the sort that clarifies why certain remarks carry extra weight. Ethan was 9, sitting at a dinner table where silence meant judgment. His mother, tired and distracted, made a passing comment about him being sensitive in front of relatives. The room shifted. He felt small. He folded that memory into the backpack. As an adult, he carried it like an underlying assumption. If people notice any flaw, then loss follows. These early patterns, family voices, early criticism, and the survival wiring, are the raw material of our adult reactivity. They are not destiny, they are input. The project of not taking things personally does not erase scars. It offers tools to hold them without letting them erode you. The first tool is naming. When the manager's remark or a friend's sharp sentence lands, a useful first question is simple. Is this about me or about them? That question stops the automatic verdict long enough for evidence to accumulate. It's not a magic shield. It is a pause that invites curiosity. In Ethan's notebook, he called it the one-liner. It was a quick diagnostic to shift from accusation to inquiry. Later in his practice, he would formalize it into a 3-second bell, a mental count before the narrative about himself takes over. For now, the one-liner gave him a foothold. A second tool is to decode intent in neutral terms. If someone calls you slow at work, do not immediately assume it means they despise you. Consider that they might be nervous, pressed for time, or insecure about their own performance. This is a cognitive trick. You expand the list of plausible causes. The immediate alternative reduces the power of a single explanation. When Ethan began to test this, the sting dulled.
A third tool is curiosity-based questions. What would make them say that now? What else could this mean? Curiosity dissolves the certainty that fuels emotional storms. It is both a cognitive and embodied practice. When you choose curiosity, your breath alters, your posture softens, and you are more likely to gather relevant information before acting. After a few weeks of diary notes and small experiments, a coach-like voice, the narrator you are hearing now, entered his inner field. Not as a miraculous answer, but as a steady guide. Observe, name, question, practice. That voice invited him to distinguish two related but different things, self-esteem and self-worth. Self-esteem is often situational. It's what you feel when you're praised, when achievements stack up, when feedback glows. It rises and falls with external signals. Self-worth is deeper. It is a baseline sense of value that does not hinge on performance. It is less about what you did and more about who you are in the human sense. Think of self-esteem as a thermostat that fluctuates, and self-worth as the account balance you return to when tests clear. For many people like Ethan, the strategy has been to chase esteem in the hope of securing worth. That strategy is expensive and unstable. When your sense of value depends on others' approval, you grant them a veto power over your peace. The alternative is to cultivate internal worth through practices that are not dependent on applause. Ethan started with 3 micro-practices. The first was a values inventory. He listed 5 things that mattered: curiosity, reliability, kindness, learning, and clarity. For each, he wrote what acting in alignment with that value looked like in daily life. Curiosity meant asking a question in a meeting rather than pretending he already knew. Reliability meant finishing projects on time. Kindness meant he would say, "I appreciate your help," at least once a day. These were modest pledges, not grand proclamations. The point was alignment, small acts that create internal coherence. The second practice was a short daily ritual of acknowledgement. Each evening he wrote 3 things he did that day that aligned with his values, not achievements, actions. He noted, "I asked a clarifying question in the 9 a.m. meeting," or "I took a break instead of scrolling when overwhelmed." The ritual did 2 things. It provided evidence that contradicted the mind's narrative of failure, and it trained attention to notice behavior rather than to rely solely on external validation. The third practice was compassionate reflection. When a critical thought appeared, the automatic "I'm not enough," he paused and addressed it with curiosity. Where did this thought come from? He traced it not to a fixed truth, but to a moment in time, last week's feedback, or that childhood comment. Naming the origin defanged the thought. It became a piece of information, not an indictment. These practices were not cures. There were days Ethan skipped the evening ritual. He slept badly and reverted to old patterns. On those days, the backpack of rocks felt heavy again. But the point was iterative progress. Small, consistent acts accumulate. Over months, the baseline shifted. He began to feel a steadier sense of worth that did not require constant external confirmation. Interludes of reflection are helpful here. Take a moment and ask yourself 2 questions, aloud or in a journal. What 3 values matter to me? Which small action today would align me with one of those values? The answers need not be heroic. "I will listen fully for 3 minutes without interrupting" is enough. The power is in repetition. One evening, after a day of minor slights and a meeting that left him hollow, Ethan tried the practices in real time. A colleague brushed off his suggestion in a way that would have sent him into a spiral 2 months prior. Instead, he breathed, named the thought, "They think I'm naive," and asked silently, "Is it about them or me?" He imagined a few alternative explanations. The colleague was pressed, the colleague favors a different approach, or the colleague was projecting anxiety about a deadline. The steam of his immediate reaction cooled.
He made a clarifying counterpoint in the meeting rather than withdrawing. It did not go perfectly. The colleague remained dismissive, but the personal collapse did not follow. The difference, he later wrote, was that the evidence he gathered did not confirm his worst narrative. These early wins are fragile and instructive. The goal is not to become immune to all criticism, nor to never feel bad. The goal is to stop building your identity on the shifting sands of others' views. That takes practice. A few weeks into his notes, Ethan had a vivid relapse that reminded him why the work is not linear. He received a message from a childhood friend that read, "I thought you cared more." It was short, sharp, and unadored. The immediate interior loudspeaker translated it as, "You are failing at friendship." He reread every interaction they'd had in the last year. The mind offered proof. The one time he missed a call, the one text that went unanswered. He felt a cold certainty setting in. This time, he tried another practice, the 24-hour rule. Rather than reply at once from a place of hurt, he decided to wait and process for a day. That pause was not avoidance, it was quality control. He used the time to consider context, to draft a response, and then wait to see if it still felt right the next morning. The delay prevented escalation and allowed space for curiosity. In the morning, he learned that his friend had been going through a crisis and that the phrase had been a plea, not an accusation. The relief was not miraculous, it was a consequence of a small habit that reduced needless pain. Micro-practices like the values inventory, the nightly acknowledgement, and the 24-hour pause are the scaffolding of internal worth.
They reduce reactivity by building evidence and creating default alternatives to immediate collapse. They do not remove the hard moments, rather they change the trajectory. Ethan's progress was not linear. He had nights where old scenes replayed, and the pack of rocks felt heavier. He also had small reversals that were important information. When his partner asked for something and he reacted defensively, he discovered that boundary work needed attention. Each relapse shone a light on an area he had not yet trained. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the manager's remark, his team prepared for a high-stakes presentation. Ethan felt the old familiar flutter, a mixture of adrenaline and dread. The urge to prepare an over-explained slide deck came on strong. The night before, he opened his notebook and reviewed his values: clarity, curiosity, reliability. He trimmed his slides to be clear rather than comprehensive. That night, he noted, "I presented less but spoke more from curiosity." It was a small victory, and the response from the room was generative rather than catabolic. Even so, the work to not take things personally requires more than habits. It requires boundaries. When you learn to separate what is yours to carry from what belongs to someone else, you reduce unnecessary suffering. The categories that help here are practical: responsibility, interpretation, energy, and standards. Responsibility. Ask, what is my role here? If someone disrespects you in a meeting, are you responsible for their emotional regulation? Not generally. You are responsible for your behavior. That distinction is freeing. Ethan started to ask before reacting. Do I need to own this, or do I need to communicate clearly? Interpretation. Notice that you are interpreting, not reading facts. The ability to label a thought as interpretation rather than truth deflates it. Ethan learned to say silently, that is one possible interpretation, which allowed him to test alternatives. Energy. Consider the cost of engagement. Some battles expend more emotional energy than they are worth. Walking away is not always avoidance. Sometimes it is stewardship of resources. Ethan had to practice this gently, withdrawing from unhelpful arguments without shaming himself for standing up for what matters. Standards. Set boundaries about what is acceptable. This is not control, it's clarity. If a colleague consistently undermines you in meetings, you can say, "I prefer we address concerns privately," or request a different form for feedback. Boundaries can be delivered with firmness and kindness. Early attempts often meet resistance. People accustomed to pushing boundaries may push back. Expect this. The point is consistency, not perfection. He practiced one boundary that felt small but revealing. A teammate habitually interrupted during meetings. Instead of escalating, Ethan used a prearranged signal. He would raise a hand and say, "I'd like to finish," then continue.
The first few times he felt guilty for asserting himself. The guilt was a good indicator that internal boundaries required reinforcement. Over time, interruptions decreased and his sense of voice increased. Each of these categories, responsibility, interpretation, energy, and standards, has an applied question. Responsibility. What part of this outcome am I actually in charge of? Interpretation. Might there be other plausible explanations? Energy. Is engaging this debate worth the cost? Standards. What behavior will I no longer accept? Before sleep one night, Ethan wrote 3 journaling prompts into his notebook, practicing the habit of reflection. Where did I take something personally today? What evidence supported that interpretation? What alternate explanations existed? These exercises did not fix everything, yet they created a rhythm of attention that over time shifted how often he defaulted to personalizing events. The backpack of rocks did not vanish, but he learned to put it down for a while. As the weeks passed, patterns became clearer. Certain people reliably pressed the vulnerabilities he carried. Noticing the pattern is the first step to choosing a response other than collapse. For some, like a seasoned colleague whose insecurity results in harsh comments, distance and assertive communication are protective. For others, a change in tone or better context will be sufficient. Ethan's notebook is filled with small dialogues he rehearsed silently. When you say X, I hear Y. Is that what you meant? The practice of turning accusation into question often defanged potential conflicts. It also served as an invitation to the other person to own their interior state. The weeks were not dramatic. There were no sweeping conversions, no miraculous overnight shifts. The change was incremental. One less sleepless night, one more honest conversation, one boundary set without apology. The narrative arc of Ethan's life had pivoted in small ways toward internal authority. Then, late on a rainy afternoon, a text arrived that tested the fragile gains. It was from a former supervisor who had once publicly criticized him in a way that still left a bruise. The message was brief and cold. The old voice rose. Of course they still think you're weak. Ethan felt the stomach drop and a familiar heat behind his eyes. He had learned to pause, but the pause was short and uncertain. The pack of rocks shifted. He closed his eyes and imagined the backpack at his feet. He heard the mental bell, the 3-second pause he had not yet formally practiced but had begun to imagine. He counted. 1, 2, 3. The count was not an avoidance, it was an invitation to curiosity. He drafted a response that acknowledged the message's content without collapsing. He asked a clarifying question. He waited. This is the point where practice meets pressure. The lesson is rarely in the first attempt, but in the response to the relapse.
Ethan's reply held a different tone than his old defensive one. It was steadier. He felt a small, real sense of agency. The moment did not absolve all his old doubts, but it showed that the axis of his life could tilt. The difference was not a magic immunity to pain. It was a growing capacity to choose how to carry it. Pause here a moment and reflect. Where has a small remark lingered in your life? Name one recent sentence that you replay. Ask yourself, is this a fact or an interpretation? That question alone begins the process of unhooking. Ethan's journey is only beginning. He has not solved everything. He still carries weight, and he will face people who test his boundaries and his new practices. But in these weeks he has laid down the scaffolding of a different life, naming cognitive patterns, practicing micro-habits that build internal worth, and experimenting with boundaries that protect energy. The next steps are to expand these practices into more robust tools, a formal 3-second rule to interrupt automatic judgments, the 24-hour practice for processing criticism before reacting, and deeper strategies for dealing with repeated patterns, people who repeatedly trigger projection, displacement, insecurity, or control. On a late night, while packing a small bag for a weekend trip, he took an ordinary measuring tape and mentally measured the new distance between himself and the old reflexes. It was uneven, sometimes larger, sometimes minute, but measurable. The metaphor fit. Freedom is not a sudden evacuation. It is the slow clearing of luggage until the load becomes manageable. When he zipped the bag closed, he felt a small lightness. The apartment felt the same, the city outside the same, but inside him something was shifting. He would need to practice more, to fall and to rise again. The rest of the story is the work of those repetitions, applying the rules in a workplace that rewards conformity, in relationships that carry histories, and in family systems that test consistency. He would meet more people who push him toward old patterns. He would fail some days. He would also find days where criticism turned into learning, and where boundaries created safety rather than isolation. For now, the immediate transition is toward skill building, precise, repeatable practices that are teachable and testable. Ethan is ready to enter that phase. He knows he is not invulnerable. He knows the journey will be iterative. But he has discovered the most important lever, that much of his pain had been produced by his interpretations, not by clear, undeniable facts. A sound interrupts his thoughts, a notification blinking on his phone. He reads a curt update about a project pivot at work, a situation that in the past would have produced hours of rumination. He sets the phone down, breathes, and without a fanfare, prepares to try the small pause again. The scene narrows on that simple choice. Will he respond from old habit or from a newly practiced stance? The choice is not dramatic. It is the daily work of becoming someone who doesn't need other people's validation to know his value. The rest of the journey is a workbook of moments like this one, measuring, practicing, failing, adjusting. The tools ahead are practical, refining the pause into a reliable rule, learning to turn criticism into a development plan, drawing clearer boundaries with people who repeatedly project or control, and preserving connection without allowing emotional contamination. Ethan's story continues from the small decision he made in his kitchen that night. What happens next is practice in deeper contexts: the presentation room where pressure multiplies, the family dinner where old dynamics reemerge, the encounter with someone whose pattern is chronic and difficult. Each will demand specific strategies and ethical firmness. He will also be tested by moments where being kind to himself requires saying no to others. Before moving forward, it's useful to leave you with a short exercise you can use immediately. Take a moment, breathe, and list 3 recent moments when a small comment affected you. For each, write one possible alternative explanation for the person's behavior. Then choose one and practice responding from curiosity rather than judgment. These small acts are the building blocks of a life less tethered to external opinion. Ethan zipped his bag, turned off the kitchen light, and for the first time in a long stretch of nights, allowed himself to sleep without ruminating for more than a few minutes. The pack of rocks was still at his feet, but tonight it felt possible to stand without it. The next morning would bring tests. Some would be small and some large. The measure of change would not be in avoiding pain entirely, but in how he behaved when pain arrived. He set the phone face down and counted in his head. 1, 2, 3. The count was not ceremonial. It was a soft intervention between instinct and action. On 3, he chose curiosity. Are they asking for a status update or an opinion? He whispered to himself, because questions reframed the instinct to personalize. He drafted a calm reply that checked the facts and offered a next step rather than a collapse. He hit send. That small decision, 3 quiet beats, felt like a rehearsal for something larger. It was the core of the practice he now named the 3-second rule. The rule was simple. When a remark lands and your body begins to tighten, take 3 seconds to breathe, name the immediate thought, and ask one evidence-seeking question. The rule was intentionally short so it could interrupt the brain's fast lane. It would not fix everything. It would, over many repetitions, change the default. A week later, the 3-second rule would meet a tougher test. His sister called, voice thin with an unresolved argument from childhood.
"You never listened to me, Ethan," she said. The sentence was a match to old tape loops. Without a pause, he would have answered defensively, reciting dates, proving his intent, shriveling into an apology. Instead, he counted. 1, 2, 3. He heard his old pattern, the need to defend, arrange itself into the shape of a memory. The thought was clear. They think I'm a bad brother. He asked a curiosity question instead. What made you feel unheard right now? The question softened the exchange. His sister explained that she felt dismissed all week at work and projected that frustration toward him. He didn't flee the feeling or swallow it. He recognized the origin of the heat as belonging to her moment, not as a verdict on his worth. They arranged a time to talk when both had more capacity. That was the second clear application: family. The third came unexpectedly in the elevator at work. A senior leader, someone notorious for bluntness, nodded as Ethan passed and said, "Keep your head down on this one." The tone was offhand, almost casual. For Ethan, those 5 words could have reopened months of old worry. He felt his jaw tighten, his heart speed. He breathed and counted the 3 seconds. On 3, he asked himself, is this about them or me? He imagined the leader's pressures, a board breathing down a neck, metrics to hit, reputation to defend. He chose to ask a clarifying question later in the day. When you said keep your head down, what did you mean for our team? The conversation that followed was practical rather than personal. The leader was warning about optics, not critiquing Ethan's competence. The comment still stung a little, but it did not become a week-long habitat of doubt. The 3-second rule proved itself not as a shield but as a hinge, moments when action could turn a hurt into information or into isolation. The practice required 3 things: a brief pause, a naming of the automatic story, and at least one curiosity-driven question. Those steps created space for evidence to accumulate. Evidence is the antidote to the mind's worst assumptions. If you try this now, pick an everyday instance: a curt email, a sideways glance, a missed RSVP. Count 1, 2, 3. Name the first thought. Then ask, is this about them or about me? If you listen to the answer, you'll often find it points away from you. A few weeks into regular practice, Ethan confronted a different kind of test: explicit professional criticism. His manager called him in for a mid-year review. Ethan had prepared. For the old Ethan, that meant rehearsing apologies and clarifying justifications. For the new practice, preparation meant 2 things. He wrote down the facts of the projects, and he reviewed his values list. He arrived ready to listen. The manager's first sentence was blunt. "We've seen a few missed deadlines. I'm concerned about your consistency." The line landed. He felt the old instinct to explain, to charm, to minimize.
This was a place where the 24-hour rule, an intentional habit he'd begun to use for emotionally charged responses, could be misread as avoidance. But process matters. For reviews that affect career paths, the appropriate tool is not always delay. The 24-hour rule is best for emotionally reactive communications, texts and snaps, and for processing criticism that triggers hurt before a measured reply. Performance feedback, by contrast, often demands immediate engagement and a plan. He used both tools that day. 3 seconds to ground, then active curiosity. "Can you tell me which projects you had in mind?" he asked. He listened without defense and took notes. The manager named 2 projects with missed milestones and a pattern. When scope changed midstream, Ethan's habit was to wait for clarifying direction rather than propose a plan. The problem then was not incompetence, it was an approach misalignment. "Thank you," Ethan said. "Can I take 24 hours to reflect on these items and propose a corrective plan?" The manager nodded. The request was practical and professional. The 24-hour pause here functioned as a commitment to think clearly and return with specificity, not as an escape route. The next day, Ethan drafted a plan, explicit checkpoints, contingency signals, and a communication rhythm to prevent future slippage. He shared it, the manager approved, and subsequent projects ran cleaner. The feedback had become fuel. Turning criticism into fuel is neither a trick nor a stoic suppression. It's a practice of translation. Separate the emotional wrapper from the informational core. When someone says you're inconsistent, ask, which actions convinced you of that? Then log the facts and make a plan. The act of moving from feeling to evidence to action dissolves the emotional charge and produces measurable growth. In the months that followed, Ethan developed a series of decoding techniques, small mental movements that transformed other people's words into data rather than verdicts. One method was the 3 hypotheses test. When a comment landed, he forced himself to generate 3 plausible, non-personal explanations. A teammate's curt email could be 1. Deadline pressure, 2. Personal stress, or 3. A misreading of the project status. Seldom was the personal motive the only plausible option. Generating alternatives is a cognitive inoculation against the mind's pull towards self-centered stories. Another technique was context scanning. Quickly map the other person's recent patterns. Have they been more irritable lately? Have they had other high stakes? Is this behavior new or characteristic? Pattern recognition helps you decide whether to respond with curiosity, to set a boundary, or to maintain distance. There are limits. Sometimes the behavior you observe is repeated and harmful. That is where boundaries move from theory to practice. Ethan learned that a boundary is not a wall, but a statement of reality. He practiced 4 types of boundaries with distinct questions to guide action. Responsibility boundaries. Ask, what is mine to carry here? When a colleague angrily shouted at the team during a planning session, Ethan recognized he was not responsible for the other's emotional regulation. He responded, calmly, I hear your frustration. Let's take a minute to identify the specific issues so we can fix them. The statement refused to absorb the anger while offering a practical path forward. Interpretation boundaries. Label the interpretation as one option. I may be misreading this, but I heard you as saying X. This invites correction and reduces automatic escalation. Energy boundaries. Estimate the cost. I can't engage on this topic right now. Can we schedule a time when I can give it full attention? Energy boundaries guard against drains that produce collateral damage in other parts of life. Standards boundaries. Define behavior norms. In our meetings, we don't interrupt. If you have feedback, wait for the debrief. Standards create structural protections that reduce reckless slippage. Early attempts to set boundaries may provoke resistance. People will test consistency. Ethan found that the test wasn't a failure, but information. Either the boundary held, in which case the relationship moved to a healthier place, or the boundary failed, in which case the relationship required more significant distance. Either outcome was preferable to the old pattern of silent assimilation. Not all boundaries require dramatic conversation. One afternoon, a colleague known for interrupting cut across Ethan during a brainstorming session. He paused, used a prearranged phrase he'd practiced, I want to finish this thought, and waited. The colleague snapped back, but the team watched. Over time, interruptions decreased because standards had been made visible. Ethan's voice rose in the room because he had created microarchitecture for it. A few months later, an older friend fell into a pattern that tested both firmness and empathy. The friend had become a chronic victim in conversations. Every story turned toward how unfair life was, and how each small setback was someone else's fault. Ethan felt pulled into caretaking, offering fixes and apologies that were unnecessary.
He recognized the signal. The friendship was causing him emotional contamination, sympathy that drained rather than connected. He tried a different posture. First, he acknowledged empathy. That sounds really hard. Then he asked a curiosity-based question that encouraged agency. What do you want from me in this moment? The friend answered, as often happens, that he wanted validation. Ethan could offer empathy without becoming a therapist. He also set a boundary. I can listen for 20 minutes and then I need to switch topics so I can tend to other things. The friend resisted at first, but eventually adjusted.
The relationship didn't end, it shifted in structure so that empathy did not calcify into responsibility for another's emotional world. Handling chronic dynamics, narcissists, manipulators, chronic victims, requires both clarity and limit setting. A narcissist seeks validation to feed a deficit. They use admiration as currency. Manipulators angle for leverage by shifting facts and guilting others. Chronic victims rely on external rescue to avoid responsibility. Each pattern has predictable features. Describing them can help, but the ethical core is not to label people harshly. It's to choose practices that preserve your agency. Ethan met a manipulative colleague who attempted to reroute credit for a shared piece of work. The colleague would reframe conversations to imply Ethan had agreed to an unfair distribution of labor. Instead of arguing every reframing, Ethan kept meticulous records, emails, timestamps, a shared document of responsibilities. When the manipulator attempted to rewrite history in a meeting, Ethan presented the documented facts calmly. The presence of clear records removed much of the manipulative power. Manipulation thrives in fog. Light, fact-based clarity undermines it. A confrontation with a narcissist occurred at a project celebration, where a senior voice took disproportionate credit and then criticized the team's efforts in the same breath. Ethan felt the old pull to compensate, to apologize as a prophylactic. He counted 3, chose one curiosity question. Can you say more about which parts you think fell short? And listened. The leader's critique dissolved into a performance about image. Ethan refused to absorb an identity verdict. Later, when team members echoed the leader's claims, Ethan used standards. We will evaluate the deliverable against X metrics and reconvene. The standards redirected the conversation from personality to performance. Advanced emotional immunity is not avoidance. It is selective engagement, clarity, and a willingness to reframe interactions as information transactions were possible. It also requires protecting energy. There will be people you cannot change. The work is to change your reaction. Connection without contamination is the tightrope of emotional life. Empathy is not a sin. Caring is not the same as carrying. The difference shows up in 2 things: boundaries and internal regulation. Empathy without boundary becomes caretaking. Empathy with boundary becomes presence. In a long conversation with his partner, Ethan learned a lesson about matching versus mirroring. Mirroring is a capacity to reflect another's emotional state. You seem frustrated, which validates and can soothe. Matching is adopting the same affective tone, which can escalate or perpetuate the other state. When his partner described a conflict with her mother, Ethan felt sadness rising in sync. He had practiced mirroring. It sounds like that felt dismissive. She sighed and said, yes. Instead of matching, sinking into sadness with her, he offered a question. What would help you feel less dismissed next time? The question shifted the conversation toward agency and solutions without deflating her feelings. Parenting and close relationships multiply the stakes because histories and obligations are entangled. The work is to remain boundaried without abandoning care. When his partner's family dynamics triggered him, Ethan paused, counted 3, and asked what part of the interaction required his response and what part required his observation. He found that many moments simply required witness, being present and holding a perspective rather than intervention. Ethan's workplace continued to be an arena where both the backpack and the new toolset met. He learned political literacy in a practical, non-cynical way. Politics at work are about influence, resources, and narratives. You cannot remove politics, but you can learn to navigate them without making them a referendum on your worth. One principle stood out: clarify the metrics. When someone uses politics to attack tenor or motive, anchor conversations to measurable outcomes. If a colleague suggests you are not a team player, ask which behaviors would indicate team player here. Convert vague accusations into observable criteria. This strategy keeps the conversation accountable. Another principle was to build alliances through reliability and visibility. Reliability, doing what you said you would, builds trust. Visibility, making the work and the contributions known, reduces the space where misattributions take hold.
Ethan began to send short summary emails after key meetings, decisions, owners, and next steps. The practice reduced friction and kept the record clear. When a promotion cycle came, Ethan found himself tempted to over-explain, to plead for favor. Instead, he paired visibility with preparation. He requested specific feedback from stakeholders and used that feedback to create a portfolio of impact, projects completed, outcomes measured, and testimonials zipped into a clear narrative. He asked those he worked with to include specific examples of his contributions in review conversations. The result was not entitlement but transparency. Reviews that year emphasized his reliability and clarity. He received a promotion that aligned with his values rather than hollow title. Workplace politics will not disappear. But when you have the facts, standards, and a rhythm of clarity, you can reduce the emotional tax of the swirl. You can show up as a reliable actor rather than a reactive target. Not all tests in life are workplace-shaped. One evening, an old family pattern re-emerged in the form of a holiday dinner. The same relatives who had once labeled him sensitive now prodded at his life choices, job role, partner, the state of his apartment. The table felt like a pressure cooker of old judgments.
For many, these moments revert to frozen patterns. You become the young version of yourself again. Ethan rehearsed a different approach. He arrived with a simple plan. He would attend to connection first, standards second. If a jab landed, he would use a naming statement. When you say X, I feel Y, wrote Titan. He used the 3-second rule, named the thought, he thinks I'm lazy, and asked a neutral question. What do you mean by ambition right now? The uncle's answer opened a different conversation, one about values, rather than a replay of old wounds. The dinner was not perfect, but it was different. The pack of rocks did not gain another stone that night. As Ethan practiced these patterns, 3-second pauses, 24-hour delays when emotional reaction would be unhelpful, curiosity questions, boundaries, documentation, and standards, 2 larger shifts began to emerge. The first was behavioral. He made fewer decisions from collapse. The second was identity level. He began to develop opinion immunity. Opinion immunity is not lack of feeling or indifference. It is the state of owning your self-definition rather than delegating it to the aggregate of others' views. It looks like firmness combined with openness. You can hear critique without shrinking, can feel offense without fusing with it, can accept praise without building a throne. It is a capacity that grows with repeated practice. The true test of opinion immunity came when Ethan faced a public moment where opinions would clash. The company convened an all-hands to discuss a controversial restructuring, one that would place some roles at risk. The rumor mill had already produced 1,000 narratives about who would be rewarded and who would be sidelined. Ethan felt anxiety, not about his performance so much as about being judged by a fearful mirror. During the Q&A, a board member called out project teams for lack of agility and named a few individuals, including Ethan's team, as examples. The room hummed. In the old days, Ethan would have felt like ground meat, defensive, pleading, shrinking. Instead, he took a breath, counted to 3 quietly, and then asked a clarifying question that reframed the dialogue. Can you tell us which metrics you're using to define agility? We're ready to show recent changes and the impact they produced. The question shifted the focus from accusation to data. The board members stumbled into specifics, and several team leads presented concise evidence of iterative delivery. The moment was not a triumph in the sense of beating the critic. It was a demonstration of the new axis, facts over identity, inquiry over collapse. When an anonymous tweet later criticized Ethan's team, the comment no longer lodged as an identity wound. He cataloged it, evaluated whether it required a response, and then chose, based on standards and energy, whether to engage. Often, he did not. Transformation remained partial. There were nights he recoiled at imagined slights, and mornings when he checked his phone more than he wanted. The difference was that recovery became faster and more methodical. The pattern of practice, pause, name, question, act, became a reflexive repertoire rather than a fragile defiance. 2 final practices helped cement the change. First was public standards, making expectations explicit in teams and relationships so that vague attacks lacked purchase. If you define what counts as disrespect in a team charter, or when you tell a friend, I don't discuss acts at parties, you make the social world more legible. Second was gratitude tethering.
daily anchors that remind you of your values independent of others' voices. The nightly practice Ethan kept, 3 actions aligned with values, became a ledger of evidence for self-worth. The ledger did not eliminate pain, but offered a counterbalance. The last decisive moment in Ethan's arc took place on a gray Thursday, when an old mentor, someone who had once praised his early work but later grown distant, sent an email that, in the past, might have undone him. "We don't see your vision here anymore." For a moment, Ethan's chest tightened. He could feel the older scripts flicker. He breathed and counted 3. Then he did something he had only rehearsed. He answered with clarity, ownership, and a values-based decision. "Thank you for sharing that honesty," he wrote. "I appreciate the times we've worked together. I will continue to do work aligned with X, Y, and Z. If there's interest in collaboration, here are the projects I'm pursuing." The message acknowledged the critique without granting it authority over his identity. It ended not with pleading, but with agency. The reply closed one pattern and opened another. The mentor responded with a terse acknowledgement. A small part of Ethan felt the old sting. A larger part felt relief. He had not won the mentor's renewed praise. He had, however, refused to let the comment rearrange his self-view. In that refusal, and in the repeated choices leading there, he had become the man who didn't need validation. The phrase is not a boast, it is a record of practice. He still wanted, sometimes, to be seen. Human beings are social. The achievement was not to cut off the need to be seen, but to stop constructing identity from the traffic of other people's opinions. If you listen to Ethan's story and wonder whether it applies, consider these small, immediate practices you can try. The micropause, 3-second rule. When a remark lands, breathe and count 1, 2, 3. Name the first thought and ask one curiosity-driven question before responding. The 24-hour rule. For emotionally reactive messages, texts, or tight emails, sleep on it and respond the next day when possible.
Use the pause to collect facts and new perspectives. Values-led ledger. Each evening, list 3 actions you took that day aligned with your stated values. Not achievements, actions. Boundary checklist. For any difficult interaction, answer, what is my responsibility? What is my interpretation? What energy will this cost? What standard is being breached? Documentation habit. In professional environments, keep brief, factual records of decisions and contributions to avoid fog where manipulative narratives thrive. Short journaling prompts to try this week. Which recent comment have I replayed? List 2 alternative explanations for that comment. What one small action aligned with my values can I take tomorrow to test a different narrative? Ethan's life did not become a story of unassailable peace. He still felt the pull of old scripts, but the pace of relapse slowed. The backpack of rocks remained, yet he learned to put it down more often. His relationships stabilized. His work became clearer and more sustainable. He chose roles aligned with his values and communicated with standards. He maintained connection without contamination. He practiced empathy without taking on the burden of another's entire emotional ecosystem. In the closing months of the year, his partner proposed a small but symbolic change. They would host a monthly feedback dinner, a scheduled, structured time to share concerns and appreciations with rules that aligned with their boundaries. The dinner helped everyone see how clarity and practice reshaped interactions. People learned to name needs, to avoid projection, and to ask curiosity questions. The change was incremental, relational, practical. One evening after a long day, Ethan walked home with a light rain tapping the hood of his jacket. He felt tired but steadier than he'd been the previous year. He considered the journey, the manager's 3 words that had once broken his week, the notebook that started it all, the small rituals that hardened into habits. He smiled at the metaphors he'd used for himself, the backpack, the duck's back, and realized the most useful metaphor was that of a muscle. Opinion immunity is like learning to hold posture. It requires repetitions that eventually change the nervous system's default. Before he climbed the stairs to his apartment, he sat on a park bench and wrote one line in his notebook, as he'd done so often. Today I paused and chose curiosity. He closed the notebook, feeling less like he had to prove the truth of the sentence to anyone else, and more like he owed himself the proof. The invitation at the end of this story is not a promise of eradicated pain. It is a practical call. Try one small practice tonight. When a remark lands, count 1, 2, 3. Name the first thought. Ask a curiosity question. Then act from evidence, not from panic.
If you want to go further, pick one micro-habit, values-led ledger, the 24-hour rule for emotionally reactive responses, or documentation for work, and do it for 2 weeks. Watch what shifts. Ethan's transformation was not a dramatic conversion. It was the accumulation of small choices,
but because he carried an inner steady account of who he was and what he did. That steadiness allowed him to remain connected, generous, and alert without being drained. If you are ready to try the first step, do it now. Think of a recent small comment that keeps replaying. Count 1, 2, 3. Name the thought. Ask a curiosity question. Notice what happens. Your freedom to live by values rather than by verdicts is built one small practice at a time. If you're listening to this audiobook and you'd like a simple worksheet to guide these exercises, the 3-second rule sheet, a values inventory, and a weekly ledger, you can find the companion materials linked with this title. Use them to make the work practical and to keep the experiments honest. Ethan zipped his jacket and climbed the stairs. Inside his apartment, the pack of rocks was still there, at his feet like a familiar, sensible thing. He did not need to carry it up the stairs. He set it down, walked into the room, and did something that used to feel strange. He thanked himself for showing up. It was small. It was real. It was, in a very human way, enough.